What is the perfect tree? I suppose depending on who you ask and where the question is coming from, you could get one of a thousand different answers. Even inside the forestry industry and the paper pulp business, depending on who you ask, you could still get a variety of answers. Sappi certainly over the past decades have invested a lot of manpower, a lot of time and a lot of money in trying to get to the perfect tree. And to tell you this story, I need to tell you the story of tree 63.
There's no one tree. For a start, we do have huge variation in South Africa. So what we need to do, what we need to accept is that in South Africa we are breeding trees for certain site types, and probably on a very coarse level we're breeding trees for that sort of subtropical Zululand plain, then for that escarpment area, and then through to the Highveld, what we classically call the Highveld, which is more a temperate area where we really get really classic cold winters. In reality, there'll be very different trees for each of those sites, and that creates a lot of complexity. So we have to look at very different origins of trees for those particular sites.
It would be easier to select a perfect tree if one was simply looking for a single quality, like height or health. But in Sappi's case, this selection is a lot more complicated.
We have essentially three areas that we have to take into consideration when breeding trees. So one is yield, which is volume and density, so making the tree packing more into the same amount, the density. So that's the one part. Second part is we have to take cognizance of risk. So we have to look at things like pests and diseases, so insects and fungi and so on. We have to also accept that there are drought issues, that we have to accept that there's frost, there's snow, so a whole lot of risks that we have to take into account. And obviously we have to breed for those. So we have to ensure, for example, if we're going to breed something for the Highveld, that it's going to have to be frost tolerant or possibly snow tolerant, depending on where. And then the third aspect of it, so there's the yield, there's the risk, and then the third aspect is the quality.
For the most part, tree 63 fulfills all these requirements and has been selected as a plus tree. Like all eucalypts here in South Africa, its story begins down under.
Its mother or its parent is a tree that's probably still standing in Australia, somewhere on the border of New South Wales and Queensland. And collections from a bunch of trees, nice looking trees in Australia, were made. Seed was collected from those, taken across to South Africa and planted into provenance trials, what we call provenance trials. So based on the original progeny of that particular tree, we then went into those provenance trials and made a selection. And that is this selection. So this 63 is actually the progeny of a tree in northern New South Wales.
63's offspring, along with many others, were planted as part of progeny trials to see which were best suited for our needs and conditions.
The progeny of this particular tree satisfied the selection criteria that we had best out of all the families that were tested in that series of trials.
That means they grew fast, the offspring were healthy, they had the best pulp yield, and they had good density. So, tree 63 is a good tree. But how do you now transfer these qualities onto future generations in their thousands? One option is through selective pollination, taking tree 63 and cross-pollinating it with another tree with similar good qualities. These trees at the Shaw Research Centre are Sappi's prize pines and are essentially the parents of most pines planted across the country.
This orchard is about 30 years old. It's a grafted pine orchard. So these are top selections that have been collected from around the country and ultimately originating from different parts of the natural range of Pinus spatula, which is in Central America. And they've all been brought together here in this orchard.
Straight away I notice that the bases of these trees differ from the rest of them.
The selections would have been chosen from a plus tree somewhere out in the field, and a little piece of that tree called a scion is collected and grafted onto the rootstock and then planted here in this orchard. And that's how you bring a whole lot of different selections into one area.
As the female cones appear on these trees, Luke and his team cover them in plastic bags to prevent them from being pollinated naturally.
There's a lot of pollen floating around in the atmosphere at this time of year. So what we're doing is, before the female cones open, we're actually putting a bag on top of them to prevent them from being naturally pollinated. And then later on, once they've opened up, we're going to come back and apply a selected male pollen.
By controlling which pollen goes to which tree, you create the offspring you want. But it requires a lot of patience. It takes about 2 years for the cones to ripen, and only then can you harvest the cones and extract the seed.
We grow the seed into what we call hedge plants, and then from those hedge plants, cuttings will be taken and rooted, and then those are what's going to be deployed in field. So each seed that we produce here will become a hedge plant that will, over the course of its life, which is about 4 years, be used to make about 100 cuttings. So we can multiply our investment here about 100-fold.
The other way of creating enough offspring from plus trees is through cloning.
So this is our horticulture laboratory, and we work with both eucalypts and pines in this lab. And the idea is to use this facility to propagate plants using the tissue culture process.
Basically, they take a cutting from the tree they wish to propagate and make them grow in an artificial substrate. Once these make auxiliary shoots, those are removed and also grown in the same way.
This is one of the first stages of the process. The first thing that you do is you harvest these type of shoots from plants outside, and we would then sterilize the shoot, because this is an aseptic environment, so you decontaminate it. You don't want bacteria or anything or fungus growing in here, because this has quite a high sugar content, and so that's exactly what flourishes. So we sterilize the plant material, and then we establish it in vitro, and this is exactly what we're looking for, is for these little auxiliary buds to start producing shoots. And after a period of being in culture, we can then come in and harvest these and subculture them, so that we then transfer them onto fresh media, and these will now multiply and grow, and we can keep these going in culture for quite a long period of time.
The biggest obstacle at the moment is rooting. Some species root easily and makes the tissue culture or cloning process a very successful option. Others, like tree 63, are a bit more stubborn, and with only 1 out of 4 rooting at the moment, it is still more viable to grow from seed.
This particular species, Eucalyptus dunnii, we actually at this stage still are confined to using it as a seedling. So the way we would propagate this particular species for the forest here is to look at taking seed from these very best families and then sowing that seed in the nursery and then propagating it in that way. So we can't, unfortunately, we can, but the rooting is not good, and so it's not economical at this stage to actually make clones, if you like, from dunnii, although we're looking at that.
Whether grown in soil or in tissue culture, the researchers and breeders are continually on the lookout for plus trees and new ways of propagating them. And on top of that, they need to stay one step ahead of the market and be mindful of changing technologies and needs.
That's really what a breeder's job is, I guess, is to manage this massive breeding population of a whole bunch of species and be able to respond and understand what's happening both in the market and in the environment and respond to that as quickly as possible. That, in essence, is what our job is.
In my quest to find the perfect tree, a few things became clear. One of them is I'm not the only person searching for it. The second one is we've come a long way in the 100 and maybe 20 years since the first eucalyptus trees were brought to South Africa. But now, tree number 63 is very special, and these little trees in front of me are the trees of the future. But I don't know, by the time that they are grown up and standing in the plantations, what the next trees will look like in these trays. Maybe one of them will be the perfect tree.